Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today I have a guest with me. I have Sarah Enterline with me, and Sarah is an apologist, teacher, pastor's wife, and mother. She has degrees in biblical studies, Christian studies, social and behavior science, and philosophy. She's credentialed in California to teach history and has an MA in Christian leadership. In 2009, Sarah founded the International Society of Women in Apologetics and is currently working as an apologist with the Library of Historical Apologetics and as a writer and editor on the Special Divine Action Project. Sarah has written a new book, which is what we'll be talking about today, entitled No Apologies: The Life and Work of Susanna Newcome. The book was published by Public Philosophy Press, which has some really good books on philosophy, and so I encourage people to check that out. Yes, we actually had previously done an interview with Dr. Kelly Burton, and Retrieving Reason is the book that she published through that publisher, and so I want to definitely encourage people to check the publication website out. So Sarah, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. This is great. I'm just very blessed and appreciative of this opportunity. So.
Yeah, it's great. So I know that you even took some time to go out. You mentioned this in the introduction to your book. You actually went out to Europe to do some additional research for the book. And so it seems like you've been putting a lot of work into this for a while now. So before we get into the specifics of the book, first I wanted to just ask you more generally. You talk a lot about apologetics, and you've been doing work in the field of apologetics. So what is it that first kind of raised this interest for you? What got you interested in the field of Christian apologetics?
Yeah, well, gosh, my journey started about 16, 17 years ago when I was in Bible college. I grew up in the church, so I kind of had a foundation in biblical knowledge. My dad was a former atheist evolutionist, so his conversion was very powerful, and it was really the science that converted him to Christianity. So growing up, he was always, just encouraging us to know the facts and to really study. And then in high school, I had a biology teacher who basically tried to completely dismantle my faith at 15. But I knew he was wrong, but I couldn't argue with him. I didn't know how to do it. And so really that started my kind of journey on really talking to my dad about the science. And I got very interested in science at that age. But then I went to Bible college, and I was just kind of going because I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. And my parents basically told me, well, we'll pay for Bible college or you pay for regular college. And so I went to Bible college, of course. And basically I was there for about a year, and then I ended up in an apologetics class at Bible college. And the professor one day came up to me and said, "You should be an apologist." And at the time, I was 19. I didn't know what that meant. This is 2004. Okay. And I didn't even know like apologetics was a thing. And especially that women could do it. Right. So I assumed it was like a pastor theologian thing. And so anyways, he is actually Dr. Joe Holden, who wrote the foreword to my book. And he kind of mentored me from that point on. I really had a passion for biblical studies and the creation science and all that, but I didn't quite know how to do that as a career, as how to do that. And so he kind of took me under his wing and helped me through all my schooling and just encouraged me and gave me opportunities to speak and all those kinds of things. And so it was really him kind of saying, "Hey, I see this gifting in you," because he's an apologist. And so he's like, "I see this gifting in you, and I want to encourage that and build that up." And so it was just a blessing, because as a woman, that was rare. That's very rare for women to have opportunities like that and have someone really kind of come along and offer them things like that. So I was just really blessed. I was in the right place at the right time. And, he recognized that gifting, and he didn't see my gender as being an issue. Even though we were in a very conservative complementarian church, so it's not like women were pastors or anything. So he still saw that gifting, even though, we were in an environment where necessarily women weren't encouraged in those types of giftings. And so it's just a blessing. And then he gave me a scholarship to Veritas Seminary. And my first class was with Dr. Norman Geisler. And Dr. Geisler, I kind of went up to him and I said, I'm like one of the only few women in class. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, why am I here? I can't do this. And I just asked him, I said, as a woman, can I even do this? Is it even worth doing? I mean, am I going to be spending money on school? And I mean, can I support myself doing this? And then he was like, yeah. And then he gave me a list of women, Mary Jo Sharp, Nancy Pearcey, all these women that were already doing it and doing it very well. And so he connected me with those women. And really that started a group that just kind of allowed me to find my place in apologetics. So that's kind of what led me on this road to where I'm at today.
Yeah, that's excellent. I am fortunate to know, because it seems like there was a little bit of a movement for a while, and it's still happening, but a little bit of a movement. I'm fortunate to know several women that are involved in the field of apologetics. I've been a classmate of many of them, Kristen Davis, Melissa Kane Travis, and several others, and Kelly Burton, who we mentioned earlier. She's doing a lot of good work too, and Holly Ordway as well was a classmate of mine. So I've had an opportunity to interact with a number of them. So I think it's great, right? That the field is broadening, and it's not the same people. It's not just men, but we have different people involved in this field, which is great. And so now kind of tying into, I think what's really interesting, and in fact, just kind of a side note here. So this is your book. I love the cover, by the way. It looks excellent. And so you've written this book, No Apologies, The Life and Work of Susanna Newcome. And before you tell us a little bit about her, I just thought it was really interesting. I saw somebody kind of post a meme about, how women are seen as like, or in the past, right? They were talking about the 1600s, how women were seen as like, if they spoke up, they must be possessed or they're witches or something, right? And so, and what I found really interesting is that as you share a little bit of the background of Susanna, is that many people looked at her and her husband who taught at a university or Bible college, and they're like, no, she's the smart one. Like she's the one who's got it going on. So I just thought it was a really interesting counterexample to maybe the stereotype, and really what was the case in many instances, right? But we at least have a neat exception in Susanna. So can you tell us a little bit about her and what led you to write this book?
Well, okay, so I kind of was taking a break from apologetics because I was focusing on teaching and getting my credential in California. I love history. History is really kind of my passion. I just find it fascinating. And so because I was doing history as a teacher and I kind of had taken a break from doing the women's ministry of apologetics, Tim McGrew called me, and we had met at a conference a few years before, and he said, hey, I'm doing this project on historical apologetics. Would you be willing to work for me? And I said, of course, right? You don't say no to that. And so he said, okay, he's like, here's the deal. I want you to focus on the women. And I said, women? There are women? And I was just shocked that there were women, because I thought, when I started Women in Apologetics or the International Society of Women in Apologetics in 2009, I thought we were kind of the first. Really, 20 years ago, it was unheard of, right? And so I really thought, Mary Jo Sharp and Nancy Pearcey and Holly Ordway, I really thought they were kind of like the founders of this movement, Judy Salisbury as well. And I was thinking like, okay, no women have done apologetics before this, but I was so wrong. And so it was crazy because Tim introduced me to this list of women who did historical apologetics hundreds of years ago, or just apologetics at the time.
Right, yeah.
And I was just floored. I was shocked, and I was like, okay, but of course, even though being a woman, I would say I'm a biblical feminist. I'm very pro woman, but I'm also very pro Bible. But I thought, okay, well then their stuff is probably not that good. and just having that, ingrained in your mind, even as a woman, you get told your whole life, oh, you can't do that. That's not for you. Or, oh, if you do it, it's not going to be as good as a man's, or, oh, this and that. And even in my mind, I kind of had that in my head that, oh, it's not going to be as good as, what's already out there that we already know about. And, I was shocked when I read Susanna and these other women that they were groundbreaking, and they were writing about these things and answering these questions before a lot of the men did. And they did it very well. And especially with Susanna, because she's the first actually published. And I think that she was able to do that because of the fact that she was her husband was at Cambridge. And so she was able to have that access to the academic circles she needed in order to publish. But yeah, no, I was shocked that there were women that did this hundreds of years ago, and they did it very well. And usually you can see that a lot of the women were connected to somebody in some way that allowed them that opportunity that they would not have had otherwise. Right. There probably were tons and tons of women who did apologetics throughout history, but we never read about them because they didn't have the right connections, or maybe someone tried to stifle them in it or something like that. And so, Tim introduced me to these women, and he kind of gave me them as my project. And I read all of their works, and I started learning about them. And really, because Susanna was the first, and because she was the most, she was just the most compelling. And so I thought, I want to learn more about this woman. I really resonated with her. So that's kind of what started me on specifically her. But there are also about 14 other women that come after her that are the subject of my next book. So okay. I'm going to be doing a book on them as well. But yeah, I just felt Susanna deserved her own book, and just because she was the first, and she kind of really laid the groundwork for these other women.
That's great. And one of the things I really appreciated about her work, kind of through your book, is it really is a very good work of philosophy of religion. It is not just, somebody I could tell in reading this wasn't just an instance of, oh, here's a woman from a long time ago who happened to talk about these things. Like, no, this is a really good work on its own merit. Like it really is a strong work. And if you're familiar with the philosophy of the day, you see that she is engaging with the ideas that were in the academy at that time. So definitely was eye-opening. I hadn't heard of her before your book, but I was really impressed. Yeah, I was really, really impressed with the work, just as a work of philosophy. And so I thought that was really helpful. So you mentioned one of the key things that led you to write about Susanna was the fact that she was the first, at least to this point, as best we know, she's the first to get published in this field. Was there anything about her argumentation, about her writing that was also compelling to you, beyond just she was a woman doing this in a time that was really difficult for women to get published in this? But what about the arguments themselves? Did you find anything particularly compelling?
Well, the whole thing is compelling to me because she really is able to fit a lot in. and that was one of the praises of her book, is that people said, she was able to talk about a lot of subjects and answer a lot of questions in a very short, concise piece of work. And, she gives the case for God. She gives the case for miracles, the soul, afterlife. She gives the case for God being immanent and in our lives, as well as transcendent, that he does reveal himself to us. That she gives the case for Jesus as the creator God, as the prophesied Messiah of Israel, as the savior of mankind. And so she is able to kind of take the width of, the apologetic arguments and basically go from A to Z and really give the case for almost all of it. And, because we talk about in apologetics, okay, the first step is you give the case for God, and then you give the case for miracles, and then you give the case for the Bible, and then you give the case for, and so she really went step by step. Before that method was even created, she kind of did it. Just logically, she understood that, you have to understand that there's a God. before you can understand that Jesus is that God. And so she really was able to kind of set the groundwork for how we do modern apologetics. And she's great because she's very smart in the sense that she realizes that things need to be defined before you can talk about them. So the whole first part of her arguments is that she actually lays out definitions of terms that she's going to use. And I found that really, really helpful to know that when she's using a term later, exactly what she means by that. When I first got her work, it was in 18th century language, English, that King James English.
Right.
And the typeface was really hard to read. So it took me about a year just to translate and understand exactly what she was saying. When I first read it, I kind of had an idea of where she was going, but I didn't really fully understand the depth of her arguments and how philosophically sound they were until I really started writing them out in modern English. Once I did that and I kind of organized them, I realized, wow, she hit every single point in this work. And so that was one of the main reasons I felt that she was compelling, because she really covered so much in such a short piece of work, but also that she was really one of the first to lay out a cause and effect cosmological argument. And that to me blew my mind because, we talk about the Kalam today, and Dr. Craig gets a lot of credit for that. And it's great. And he's great, does a lot of groundwork there. But I feel like, she has this argument that really we don't hear a lot about from cause and effect today. And it's so valuable. And I feel like it makes so much sense. It's so logical the way she talks about it. And I feel like if we approach the cosmological argument from her standpoint and her arguments, we might gain more ground that way with people, because she really is appealing to the average person's common sense. And so really for me, her cosmological argument and her argument was at the miracle being not a violation of the laws of nature. So what I loved is that she answered Hume, 25 to 30 years before he even writes about it. Yeah. And so she just was smart, and she just anticipated. She anticipated what are the arguments that are going to come down based on the fact that we're dealing with this new deism, that's coming through because of the Enlightenment. She was living during the Enlightenment. And so because she anticipated, okay, well, if they're thinking this, eventually they're going to start thinking this. She kind of put the pieces together and connected the dots. She answered things before they were even asked at that time. And so, so that's why I found her argument specifically to be compelling, aside from the fact that she is a woman publishing at a time when women didn't publish. So, so that's really what it was for me.
Yeah. So you've touched on two things that really stood out to me as I was reading it. One, I really liked her cosmological argument, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. Yeah. But also what you just said, there were times where I read this and I was thinking, I wish Hume would have read this. Because as I'm reading it, you'd almost think she had Hume in mind, but she didn't. She didn't, obviously, right? And so Hume coming after her, but also an indication that she really is engaging with what's in the air in her day. And Hume didn't come, from a vacuum. He was a product of what was going on in his day. And so it just shows you what a pulse she had on her contemporaries, that she anticipates these things and is giving really good responses even before Hume's, more famous works are produced.
Right. And she actually wrote her first edition, she wrote in 1728. And it was really more actually focused on something that I love outside of this, is the argument from desire. That's one of my favorite arguments. I find it incredibly compelling, especially based on the culture that we live in today. And she really focused a lot on that in her first edition. But then Matthew Tyndall came out with his book basically on the fact that, just laying out the case for deism and that we don't need God involved in our lives to have morality and that kind of thing. And Christianity is old as the creation. That's what his title was. And really that came out in 1731. And she actually redid her book and republished in 1732, adding an entire section specifically answering his argument that God's not involved in our lives. And so she basically said, no, God does reveal himself to us. He has, and it's rational for him to do so, because without it, we wouldn't have enough to know him. And really that's kind of what showed me that she really was like, she cared so much. She had such a passion for people who might be led astray by people like Tyndale and future people like Hume, that she wanted to make sure that she answered those challenges. And one of the best answers to Tyndale's book is actually Bishop Joseph Butler, who wrote 4 years after Susanna. So Susanna, preempted him by 4 years answering Tyndale. And she did it very quickly because she knew this is going to be a problem.
Right. And
so she was able to kind of anticipate his effects, and she tried to nip it in the bud as quickly as she could.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons that I found her, I resonated with her, because, as a woman, we just have a passion for our kids and for the next generation, and for the kids that are in the schools and that maybe being led astray by false philosophies. And even though she wasn't a mother herself, she still had that motherly heart towards those who might be led astray by these philosophies. And so I really just related with her in that way. So
I do want to get to the cosmological argument, because there's an important point there, and so we'll talk about it in a second. But first, I thought it might be good if you could let our viewers know, when they purchase this, when they buy it, what is it that they can expect as they're reading through it? Are they reading you? Are they reading Sarah? What is it that they're reading?
So there are 3 sections in the book. The first section is my research. Like I said, like we talked about earlier, I went to England, and I actually went to where she was born. I went to her father's church. I went to where she got married. I went to where she was buried. I went to where she lived for 40 years of her life. So I really spent the time to get to know her as a person. And so all of the biography is based on my own personal research, just things that I have found personally about her in my travels and then in my research. So the first section is really a biography of her life. And then the second section is what I did is I rewrote her arguments in modern English. And then I actually created an outline so that they're easy to find, and they're easy to understand, and they're easy to read. So the second section is her arguments, but written in modern English, in a simpler language for the average person to understand. And then at the bottom, it was so hard because I didn't really want to change her wording too much. It is changed quite a bit to make it simpler, but I didn't want to change it so much that all you were hearing was me. So I actually added footnotes. There are footnotes at the bottom that really give more information, more clarity, more resources based on the arguments. So in the second section, you're getting her arguments in simpler English with my notes at the bottom. And then in the third section, you're actually able to read her original work in her original language. So it's untouched except for a couple things, and just changing the long S of the time to the short S and things like that. But otherwise, it's basically untouched. And that's what you're getting when you read the book. Is you're getting a biography of her life, you're getting her arguments simplified with my notes at the bottom, and then you're getting her original work and her original in the original format it was in.
Yeah, excellent. And so I also want to note, because you mentioned the footnotes briefly, but the footnotes are excellent. For those that pick up the book, you tie in a lot of what she's saying to more modern, more updated arguments in philosophy of religion, in science, and in various different fields. And so they're very helpful. So if someone, for example, were kind of intrigued by something she was saying, there's likely a footnote there that'll push them towards other contemporary writings that you can read up on to kind of fill out the argument a little bit. And so, one of the things that I appreciate, though, is I'd almost rather someone read this first than the more contemporary stuff. And it seems to me that because she's trying to be rigorous, so in her day, and I'd imagine as a woman, right, who's trying to also establish themselves as a scholar, she wants to give a very rigorous, a very well thought out and careful response to some of the objections that she was facing in her day. And she is engaging with the philosophy of religion in her day.
Right.
Whereas with the more modern things, I think, and there's great stuff out there. I mean, many people talk about us living kind of in the golden age of apologetics, and that there's a lot of truth to that. So there's some great stuff. But I do think in a world of marketing, in a world of just kind of getting it out to as many people as possible, one of the things I've noticed as a professor at a secular institution is that sometimes in popular apologetics, you get away with things that are more difficult to get away with in other settings, right? In less friendly settings. And so I kind of felt connected to Susanna as she's making her arguments, because I'm like, she's so careful in the way that she kind of lays each step out that I had a great appreciation for it. So like, yes, like read her and then look at, how have people updated some of these things, but take note of how careful she is in the way that she lays things out. So I had a really good, big appreciation for that. You've mentioned her cosmological argument. And I think largely, if we were to say, what is her main argument for God's existence? It's like a kind of cosmological argument. Yeah. For those who might be familiar with Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas, she's leaning on some of those ideas. And yet her cosmological argument, although, again, still leaning on some of those Aristotelian ideas, does look a lot more like the Kalam, a kind of first cause argument. What I love about it as a professor of humanities, as a professor of philosophy, is that she doesn't need the science of her day to prove this. And so I think that science, and this is my point, and I try and communicate this to my students, science complements something like the cosmological argument. But the cosmological argument doesn't depend on science. It's a logical argument. Yeah. And so if the premises are true, it is true, regardless of what like modern science or modern ideas in science might hold to be true. Like you have to engage her argument on its own merits. And you have to point out where she's wrong in order for the conclusion to be wrong. You know?
Right. And it's crazy because when I was reading her cosmological argument, she's right. I mean, she's a contemporary of Isaac Newton. Right. Her husband and her lived in Cambridge at the same time. Newton is a professor of mathematics in Cambridge. So, I mean, she's contemporary with some very giant people in the scientific and philosophical community. So she did probably have access to the latest, let's say, scientific discoveries or the latest, information, just being in the university system at that time. But the crazy thing is that, when we talk about, and I tell my students this all the time, the idea of God and the idea of the beginning of time, you can only take science so far. And then there comes to a point where there's no more observation, there's no experimentation, and you have to get philosophical. There has to be philosophy that comes at a certain point. You can't prove things at a certain point, and so you have to get philosophical about it. And that's what I love about her argument is, like you said, she does discuss some of those, the latest scientific discoveries of the day and the laws of physics and things, but really, it really is a philosophical argument. She just reasons that, look, if this is the case, then this is the case, right? Right. And so she just says, look, if there are like her cosmological is really that everything that exists is an effect, right? And otherwise, if you look around, why is there something rather than nothing, right? So everything that exists is an effect. Well, if it's an effect, what is the cause, right? And we look at things and we say, okay, that machine is an effect of intelligence, and the universe runs like a machine. So for us to say that, well, that machine's created and the universe isn't, even though they have the same like workings, let's say, it's just not consistent. We're not being consistent. And so philosophically, you can take the same reasoning that you use when you look at a machine and say, okay, that's obviously created. You use that same reasoning to look at the way the universe is. And I thought that that was great because, like you said, you really don't need science. That's a very common sense thing. You just look at something and go, okay, if this is the case with this, it must be the case with this. And I felt like that was, really great. She didn't have formal schooling. I mean, her dad was a pastor. She was taught. She had 9 siblings, though, so I can't imagine she had, private tutors and things like that, because her family probably didn't have the money for that kind of a thing. And so she really was self-taught, and she didn't have a university degree. And, but she was very lucky to marry a university professor and have access to the libraries there. But really what's fascinating to me is that she's mostly self-taught, but she's able to come up with these really deep philosophical arguments that people have PhDs in philosophy today to figure out. So that's why I think that her argument is so, like you said, it's really just based on more philosophy than it is science.
Yes. And I'm obviously biased in this, but to me, that's a strength as opposed to a weakness. But now I'm even more impressed. Maybe I missed that. I didn't realize she had no like formal higher education. I didn't realize that, which is even more impressive. And maybe even a case for the great books, right? Because it's clear that she's leaning on Aristotle. I mean, she had to have read Aristotle. Right. She probably read Thomas Aquinas. I mean, because the ideas are so similar in many areas. So
she leans on his unmoved mover.
Yes,
so she leans on Aquinas's.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you see that throughout her writing. So as I read it sounded like someone who was very well educated, not just in the arguments themselves, but what she's touching on has a rich history. And so, that makes it all the more impressive. Absolutely. So, what are some ways that Susanna might help modern readers, right? We've just said earlier, we're in the golden age of apologetics. We have the William Lane Craigs, we have the Greg Kokels, we have, and even some who have recently passed, like a Norman Geisler. We have all these books at our disposal. What benefit can we get from reading someone like Susanna, and especially those people who are exploring questions about faith, religion, philosophy, Christianity? How might they be helped by reading her?
Well, that's actually one of the things, as I've been really getting more and more into historical apologetics, even having the knowledge that I have and the degrees that I have, I come across groundbreaking stuff all the time, things that just blow my mind that are written in the 1800s. And I'm like, if people could just read this, like, it would help so much. And I feel like a lot of the modern apologists today, maybe through no fault of their own, maybe they just don't know about these people. I didn't until Tim introduced me to them. But really, they're missing a lot of stuff, a lot of great arguments, because they're not leaning on the giants of the past. And I feel like that's, everybody leans on Aristotle, everybody leans on Aquinas, we all lean on those big ones, right? Sure. But, nobody's talking about Thomas Rawson Burks. Nobody's talking about James Orr. I mean, James Orr is a little bit more well-known, but no one's talking about Susanna Newcome. No one's talking about Mary Broderick, she's going to be in my next book. She's an archaeologist that talked about Jesus's tomb. And it's just that no one's talking about these people because they haven't read them. But when you read these historical works, they really are, they gave the arguments that C.S. Lewis gave 200 years before C.S. Lewis gave them. And, you read these books and it's like, wow, we're all reading C.S. Lewis, but we're reading the secondary source here, like there are primary sources that we're completely missing out on because we're not reading them. And so there are things that I come across today in these historical works that I'm like, wow, that explains that so well. And I didn't even know that. And so I think one of the issues that we have, first of all, is that the apologists aren't reading the old stuff. One of the reasons could be that, the language is difficult. It does take a while to wade through it. I really, really wish, if for nothing else, that more people would go back into the historical writings and maybe translate them for a modern audience. I think that would be extremely helpful. We're trying at the Historical Apologetics Library to make that stuff available free in PDF format. We just finished the A's on our website, historicalapologetics.org. But I really wish that people would go into those and translate them for a modern audience, because I feel like we're missing out on these riches that we had from the 1700s, from 1700 all the way to, public domain 1924. There's so much there before C.S. Lewis came along. It's so valuable, but it's just a little bit harder to read. And, people just don't want to make that effort. And actually, that's one of the reasons I self-published, is because, I talked to a lot of publishing companies, but they are not interested in, they want women apologists. I was literally told, we want women apologists to write for us, but we don't want what you're doing.
Okay.
And it was just the idea that mine, I was basically told it wouldn't reach a wide enough audience. And I'm like, well, that's just sad, because
right.
My goal is not to make money. I know I'm in a very niche area, and it's
Sure.
not, my goal is not to make millions here. My goal is to enrich the academic community with this knowledge that has been lost, because all we're doing is looking from C.S. Lewis on, and we're not looking at who came before C.S. Lewis and where C.S. Lewis, where do you think he got his groundbreaking stuff from? It's crazy, because like when I think someone needs to write a book on how not groundbreaking C.S. Lewis was,
right.
because he really parroted a lot of the historical apologetic arguments that came before him. And it's obvious that he read them before, because just a lot of his stuff leans on them. And I'm like, why don't we just go to the original source
right.
and read those instead? And so that's kind of my goal with this is, I'm not, because there's just too much. There's a lot of historical apologetics out there. It's hundreds of years. I'm really focusing on the women. And like I said, my next book is the 14 other women that are out there. And I hope to find more later doing research. But I really wish that men would kind of take up this mantle of translating the old stuff for new audiences, because I really feel like that would be extremely valuable for modern readers. Susanna specifically, I feel like the fact that she's so clear in her definitions, the fact that she lays out her arguments so well, it just is this outline that kind of falls on the stuff that comes before it. She just really put it in a well ordered manner. And then also just her arguments in general. She covers the breadth of the Christian religion and
right.
all the arguments that are necessary. So I feel like modern readers will benefit just from the fact that she's so clear. And she's so concise, and she's able to hit on so much. And the thing is that the things that she's writing about in 1732, we're still arguing about those things today.
Yeah.
So it's not like her work isn't valuable. I mean, her arguments are still valid today, and you could still use them with unbelievers. And I think that's why it's good for modern people to read this work, not just to celebrate this woman of the past, but also she's got some great arguments that we could still use today.
Yeah, excellent. I think that is so important. And you mentioned how Lewis, he's benefited us because he was willing to do this. He read people that came before him, and he read widely and deeply and encouraged others to do the same. And so I think we would benefit so much from kind of taking that advice, as opposed to just kind of taking what he has to offer. Read Lewis, read plenty of Lewis, but let's read some of the people that shaped him. And sometimes what you'll see is, well, Lewis took this person in this way. I kind of like the original a little bit better. And then we're able to kind of, build off of that. You've mentioned Dr. Tim McGrew a few times. So he's a professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. And I have great appreciation for him. He and his wife Lydia have done some great work in the field of epistemology, and so I appreciate a lot of what they're doing. But he's also taken interest in this historical apologetics. I was listening to a lecture of his not too long ago, and this was something that kind of caught me by surprise. He says that the reason he kind of got into historical apologetics was, reading Hume, you're doing, dealing with philosophy of religion. And he realized that the best responses to Hume were written right around Hume's own day. Like that he realized, they answered him. We didn't continue to pass that along, but it's not like there weren't responses that showed where Hume goes wrong. And so that was really eye-opening to me. And we have this desperate need, and it's not just, we're not talking about the average Christian. We're talking even those that are interested in apologetics are not doing enough of reading widely. My very first class at Biola was with Ken Samples, and he the very first question he asked us is, who is, kind of the greatest apologist? Who is your favorite apologist of all time? And the two that led the way, right? Because we were kind of doing living and dead, or, kind of splitting it. It was C.S. Lewis and J.P. Moreland. It's Biola, so it's J.P. Moreland territory over there, right? So, and so he pointed out to us right away. He's like, we haven't gotten out of the 20th century here. Yeah. Like, we've got C.S. Lewis and J.P. Moreland who are great, right? But like the fact that nobody was naming anyone from like the past, it's an indication of our lack of engagement with a lot of the sources. It doesn't mean people aren't going to love Lewis and love J.P. Moreland. Right. They will, because they did great work, but there's a gap there. In even our education, for those of us who have higher education, there's a gap there. So again, I appreciate your work in that it tries to fill that. So I figured I would, we'll kind of work our way towards the end here to wrap this up. But I wanted to know if you had a favorite argument. I think you mentioned earlier the argument from Desire, and Susanna certainly does talk about that. But I figured I'd throw out something that I thought was really interesting, and then you can tell us about something that you really enjoyed from her work. So one of the things that really jumped out to me and I really, really liked was a section that was kind of entitled, "We Must Have Reasonable Expectations of the Evidence." Yeah. I loved that, in which she kind of lays out, when we're looking at particular questions, right? Certain questions are going to lend themselves to certain kinds of evidence. Mm-hmm. It is irrational, right? And I appreciate her kind of putting it in these terms, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's irrational to expect evidence for a question that deals in a different realm of evidence. Yes. So, for example, to require a deductive argument for a historical question, right? That's a mistake. That it's irrational to demand that kind of evidence, right. And that just seems to be a really big problem today. When I ask people these kinds of questions, it's like, well, we don't know that 100% for sure, or whatever the case may be. And I'm like, yeah, of course not. I'm asking about history here, right? We're dealing with sources. I can remember in my undergrad one day, and I went to a secular university, but I always appreciated my Old Testament professor's response. We were talking about the Exodus, and a student raised his hand and he's like, isn't it true that there's like no evidence for the Exodus whatsoever? Right. And the professor, who was not a Christian, he became visibly upset, and he's like, you have evidence sitting on your desk. And what was he talking about? Well, we have a written record. When you're doing history, you don't overlook written records as evidence. That's actually what you're begging for, is written record. Right. Like, archaeological findings are really important, but even written records, I mean, they give us more details. And so So to just dismiss it as no evidence, now you can question its dating, you can question whether or not it was really reliable, or if the authors embellished, or whatever the case is, right? You can ask all those questions, but to say there's no evidence when you have an ancient document sitting in front of you talking about it is to miss, I think, Susanna's point. No, that's exactly the kind of evidence that you're looking for.
Yeah, no, and it's really cool. Before I tell you my favorite argument of hers, I want to touch on a couple things. One is that as a history teacher in the state of California, we obviously have to follow the California state standards. And one of the things that I love, California has its issues, and so does Common Core and the educational system. But one of the things that I absolutely adore about the California state standards is that they hammer in the fact that these kids need to support their arguments with evidence, and they need to be reading sources. And so I love teaching history, because basically how I teach history is we don't open the textbook. We look at the primary sources, and then we learn about what's going on when these sources are written, but we actually read the Declaration of Independence. We actually read the Constitution. We actually read, the letters from Jamestown and all that, rather than reading what someone says about it in a textbook. Right. And that's really a skill that I feel like there was a generation where we kind of skipped that skill a bit. And, even for me growing up, we didn't do that when I was in school. Right. We just read out of the textbook. And, now that's one of the things that, for all of its faults, the public school system, that is one thing that I do love, is that I feel like the history department, putting aside some people that do revisionist history, sure. I really love that they're doing a focus on sources and just how important it is to read the original sources, because that is literally how we learn about what happened. And so that was one of the things that I appreciated about Susanna, was that she kind of reinforced that idea that look, we can't expect more evidence than what we have. Like, if this is what we have, then we have to go off this. And so, some cases there is archaeological evidence, and that's great. But sometimes, we have written evidence. And so the second thing I was going to talk about was, there's a woman named Caroline Mead, and she's going to be in my next book as well. But she really focuses on the evidence for Paul's writings, and just kind of gives the case for the fact that he is writing at the time that he did, and that he is a real person that we can trust, the historicity of Paul, basically. And what she does is she takes the writings of Paul and she compares them to the writings of Cicero. And she talks about the fact that, well, no one questions Cicero, but she does a whole comparison of their lives. She's like, we have way less evidence that Cicero ever existed, that he even wrote what we say he wrote. Yet no one in academia ever questioned Cicero. But why is it all of a sudden that we're questioning Paul? And it's literally just because it's where the conclusion leads. If we accept Cicero, it doesn't affect us in the least. Whether he was real or not, we can say he's real, because guess what? It doesn't affect us. But if Paul's real, and if what Paul says is history, and that's really what happened, then now we've got some internal things that we have to deal with, and some spiritual issues that we have to answer. And so she makes the argument that basically we can't ignore the evidence just because of where it might lead. We have to actually take the evidence for what it is, and we can't have unreasonable expectations of it either. Like you said, we can't say, okay, well, I want a written account of what happened at the beginning of time. Right. Well, that's not the evidence that you're going to find for that, right? And you can't compare those things. So those are kind of two things that I just wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good.
Just kind of some of the things that you said, but really, my gosh, she's got so many. One of my favorite arguments is her argument where she actually gives the case for substance dualism. And one of the reasons I love that is because I used to work in a pro-life organization. And one of the things that I noticed was one of the best cases against abortion is J.P. Moreland's substance dualism. That if we're talking about that there's an actual mind here, if there's an actual soul, then we've got bigger implications going on than if it's just fetal tissue, right? And so one of the things that I really liked about Susanna is that she's giving the substance dualism argument before, hundreds of years before J.P. Moreland even comes along and gives that argument. And so there's one section where, let me get to it. Nope. Where is it? Sorry, let me, it's when she's talking about the argument for the powers of the mind for the existence of the afterlife.
Right.
And she's basically saying, look, if there's a mind, if there's a soul, then there has to be something that comes after this. And basically she says that the mind and the body are obviously two different things. And if that's the case, then there must be something beyond this, because when the physical body dies, you still have something left. And so where does that something left go? What happens with that something left? And she says, we cannot accept, this is where J.P. Moreland talks about the idea that you can't measure a thought. Like you can't say, oh, a thought is round, or a thought is square, or whatever. Like we can't say that, but we know they exist. So how do we talk about them? And she says, we cannot accept that reasoning and thinking are properties of physical matter, because we have great experience with the properties of physical matter and have never found that it had any sorts of these properties. So she's basically saying, look, we know what physical matter is. We know what the brain is. We can cut open someone's head and we can see the brain matter, but can you find their thoughts? Can you see their dreams? Like, can you see their consciousness? Where is their personality housed?
Right.
Like, and so she's saying there's obvious differences between these two things. And if that's the case, she says, she talks about the fact, she says it is rational to expect then that man basically has a future existence from a consideration of the powers of his mind. That if there are powers of his mind that are not material, then after his material body dies, there's got to be somewhere that immaterial stuff goes. And so she gives the case for substance dualism. And I found that just awesome, because, you know, there is so much today where people try to say they're the same thing. They're very monistic in the idea that we're just physical animals, and you know it's a root of Darwinism and all that. But I just thought that's probably one of my favorite arguments that she makes, because when I read that by J.P. Moreland years ago, it became one of my favorite arguments. And then when I read that she did it before him, that really excited me. So yeah, so that's my favorite.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. So I want to encourage everybody who is watching to make sure to check out this book. I will leave links to the book, to Sarah's webpage, and also to the Public Philosophy Press website as well, so that people can get all the information they need and be able to purchase that book as well. So I highly recommend it. We only kind of scratched the surface of the things that Susanna talks about in the book, and again, I appreciated the setup of the book. You made it very accessible. Your footnotes were kind of like, and I think everybody who's read difficult works before knows this feeling. So many times you're like, I wish I could read this with somebody so that I could kind of have somebody to talk to, or at least somebody to help me understand. Your footnotes help that. You know, they're a way of walking someone through the text. So so it's like having a friend to kind of walk you through it that first time. So excellent job. I appreciate the work that you're doing, and I encourage everyone who's listening to check out the book. I think that it's really important, both in the field of apologetics, but also in the field of philosophy of religion. I think it's a shame that her name has kind of been lost in history in that field. So
yeah.
All right. So thanks again, Sarah. I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you for having me. It was great. I really appreciate it.
All right.